Yeah, three and two and one. Hi, everybody. We're glad you're here. Thank you for tuning into this podcast today. It's important today, very important. It's also a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much. Again, today, our guest is Craig Morley. Now, Craig is a sitting member of the ASB, but he is not here in that capacity. He's here in his capacity as a state certified general real estate appraiser in 3 states and former chair. Well, I shouldn't even say that. He just state certified general real estate appraiser in 3 states, and he has a varied experience, including having served on the Utah State Appraisal Board. So, Craig, thank you. Welcome. We're glad you're here. We appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's a beautiful morning, and I'm delighted to spend a few minutes of it with you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that out in the southern Utah desert in an early spring morning. Yeah, I bet it's gorgeous. So, Craig, let's get right into this. Now, previously, both in this forum as well as privately, we have spoken about the state of education in real estate appraisal, and neither one of us is particularly happy about it. But there's got to be a bright side somewhere to this. So let's talk a little bit about education. Let's talk about the bright side, and then let's talk about what might be the opposite of the bright side. So let me start this out with a question. Most appraisers are required to take between 75 and 125 hours, classroom hours of classes, to sit for the or to become a trainee appraiser. Now, given what's covered, uh, and the classwork is varied. I don't debate that, but given what's covered, does that education uh, prepare the trainee to be an appraiser, or is it that education plus the level of training the appraiser gets from the supervisor that turns a trainee into an appraiser?
You know, the challenge I think that trainees have is that when they start the educational process, and I think the material that is presented in those initial qualifying education courses is thoughtful. It covers the topics and issues that appraisers need to be aware of. But I think the problem is that in many cases, they have no practical experience. So the material that they're covering, in some sense, doesn't have any meaningful application. You haven't had the opportunity to actually see why the material that's being presented is relevant. And in my experience, there's always seems to be this logical disconnect between the concept of something and the application of something, which is why the trainee process, this mentor system is supposed to be able to marry the education with the practical application. Unfortunately, if you've got a trainer who doesn't have a firm grasp on the material that the educational material, then oftentimes they go through the mechanics of doing something without understanding the reason why they're doing it. And so oftentimes, if they don't have this practical application combined with the educational material, oftentimes we see appraisers that turn into the proverbial form filler because they don't really understand why they're doing what they're doing. And years ago, as I think everybody knows, appraisers are starting to get old. And some of the appraisers who came into the profession came in when the educational requirements were pretty lax and the training requirements were pretty lax. And so while they have met the minimum requirements, they certainly don't have the skill set necessary to help trainees become the quality appraisers that the market is beginning to demand.
Craig, you mentioned the concept of form fillers. And let me ask you a couple of questions about that. Okay, the ubiquitous 1004 form, that does have to be filled out, and there's got to be something in the various boxes. So when you talk about form fillers, uh, isn't that what appraisers are supposed to do, or does it go beyond that? Help us out here.
You know, the problem I think we've got with the forms, especially if I'm in a residential environment, is that the form becomes the appraisal instead of just a tool, a method of communication assignment results for an appraisal. And if we don't understand the reasons why we put in that form report, what is supposed to be there, it becomes a mechanical process with very little meaningful analysis that goes into the filling out of that form. So a form is one of many ways to communicate assignment results. But if the form is the only thing that an appraiser uses, it becomes so mechanical that it really becomes very thoughtless in terms of how we're communicating these results. And I frequently will talk to appraisers who feel like that filling out the form is just the mechanical part of coming to that final value conclusion. So there's not a lot of thought that goes into filling out page 1 of that 1004 form. And so we oftentimes find some real inconsistencies because they're cloning or duplicating neighborhood descriptions and things like that, that really present a poorly developed result and create a lot of problems. So yeah, one of the things that we've tried to do is we've brought trainees in. We've tried to bring them in and helping with commercial appraisal work where they have to write a complete area description, neighborhood description, site description, building description, go through all of the elements of highest and best use. And we found that from a training standpoint, that having to go through and explain in detail these various elements associated with the property and the market in which it's located tends to help them better understand what you put in the form. And it tends to help make them a little better communicators when it comes to us reporting assignment results.
Okay, now you mentioned making them better communicators. Let's go back to page 1 and the concept of filling out the form rather than communicating by filling out the form, which is what the form is for, to communicate the appraisal. So let's go back to the concept of communicating. So on page 1, the year build is 1942. Okay, making the building effectively 80 years old. But the appraiser puts 30. And the appraiser says, I don't know, it just looked like 30. It looked like every other house in the neighborhood, and people are still living in them. So it's effectively 30 years old. And there is no evidence, there is no support. It's just the appraiser's 30 years experience, which obviously has to count for something. But yet and quite frankly, maybe the appraiser's going to guess right. But in not having support for that 30 years, in not extracting it from the market, and not getting it from peers, or in other words, just pulling it out of the air, atmospheric extraction, as I call it. How is the appraiser failing to communicate anything? I mean, the appraiser's been doing this since, forever. And the appraiser's got the experience, the appraiser knows the market. So what's wrong with an educated guess? Why does there have to be, why does USPAP get all excited about support by irrelevant evidence and logic?
That is probably one of the most commonly abused or abused, I guess, things that happen within an appraisal is we don't know, so we kind of guess. And most appraisers will say, well, what difference does it make? Why does it matter? And I think the thing that appraisers sometimes fail to realize is that the assignment results are designed, especially if it's for a lender, is designed to help that lender evaluate the risk associated with the property. They have certain criteria in making a loan. And so if I come in and say, well, the remaining effective age or the remaining economic life is 30 years, and I do that because my lender says, well, if it's less than 30 years, I can't make a 30-year loan on the property. So clearly it has to be 30 years. Well, that may or may not be the right answer. It may not be it may or may not be a supportable answer. But the reality is that lender is looking at that to determine, is this a land loan? Is this a property in transition? Is there something going on to where this property is not going to be used as a residence for the next 30 years? And so there's a lot of factors that we have to consider, and part of that's developed in your highest and best use. But what are the economic trends? The house might be relatively new, but if I see a lot of properties being reclaimed for commercial uses or for other things, it has very little to do with the actual age. It may be the economic trends that are taking place. On the other hand, if I see areas where I've got a 40, 50-year-old home and there's lots of homes in the area that are still in use at 80, 90, 100 years with appropriate updating and renovation, you can prolong the life of a property for a long time, if not fundamentally indefinitely. And so I think the thing that the client is looking for is develop an opinion of economic life, and make sure that it's supported with some kind of meaningful data. And there's lots of different ways to do it. If someone has subscribed to something like the Marshall Swift cost handbook, they've got a really nice little table in the back of the book that shows the effects of improvements made to a property. So you can look at it, and it's kind of this jagged kind of line that shows that in the first couple of years, you'll see some some percentage depreciation. And then when I paint and recarpet, the economic life, the life changes. And that may or may not reflect what the market is doing, but it's a generally accepted method. And if I have that in my work file, I can rely or look at that and use that as at least a method to support it. There's mathematical processes which you can go through to do the same thing. But I think this idea that I simply plug a number in because 30 years is what the lender needs in order to make the loan is probably the wrong thought process that we're going through in doing that. And we hope that it's not just economic life or effective age, but it's the entire process. And probably one of the most frustrating things that I see, and when I was on the board, I would, if we had an appraisal come in, would oftentimes point this out, is that in the description section, part of the process of describing the improvements is supporting that effective age or remaining economic life. So we had one person in before the board who, we said, you're showing that this actual age of this property is 30 years old and the effective age is 15 years old, but you have not described any improvements made to the property. That you're not describing any remodeling, any updating, any improvements. How did the effective age change? And the response is, well, everybody knows that the effective age is half of the actual age. And I go, well, okay, I don't know that. Where's your documentation? Well, I read it in a book somewhere. Well, which book? And obviously they didn't, and it wasn't there. That was something that their mentor had just kind of extracted to use as a method. But in reality, the improvement description section is the place where I use to support my effective age. So if I've gone in and replaced the carpets, or there's been periodic maintenance, or I've remodeled the kitchen, or done one of a number of things, it is part of that support that I'm helping to communicate to my client that, hey, they've gone in and replaced the mechanical system. They've gone in and replaced the floor coverings. They've painted the house. They updated the cabinets. Those things all are a factor that plays into supporting that economic age or the effective age. And if we would do a better job of describing specific improvements that have been made, which usually what happens is you'll read a report where somebody's clicked the box and says, yeah, it's been remodeled in 1 to 5 years. Okay, what does that mean? What did they specifically do? What does that mean to you? And if we don't take the time to describe that, it leaves a lot to the user of that appraisal's imagination to try to describe that. And oftentimes people will look at pictures to try to fill in the blanks. But I think if we were effectively communicating our assignment results, we would be providing more specific information about that, which then goes to that very point that you've asked is the unsupported or supported effective age that needs to be part of how we're developing and coming up with our value conclusions.
Okay, in the concept of the cost approach, which in which a total economic life, effective age plays a major part. In the typical real estate appraiser's education, that might involve 6 hours of classroom time, maybe. And a lot of that is going to be spent putting together the cost of a house, its various components, the slab, the wiring, the plumbing, etc. Now, given the scope of what you just said, is 6 hours, I'm going to ask two questions. Is 6 hours sufficient to cover the cost approach to that depth? And the second question is, given the mentoring system, the supervisory system that we currently have, is that sufficient to teach appraisers everything they need to know about the cost approach?
Well, the answer to the first one is no, it's really not. I mean, it gives you an introductory to the basic concepts of the cost approach. The answer to the second is depends on the supervisor. If the supervising appraiser has then taken the time to go and further obtain either through experience or practicum courses or education, then that mentor can fill in the gap that was created by the lack of education on the cost approach. I think the single biggest problem we have with the cost approach right now is the appropriate calculation for obsolescence. And so frequently what happens is an appraiser relies simply on the calculation that is done in their software, where it's doing some kind of straight line calculation, and it's usually saying, well, the effect, the actual age or the economic life of this property should be 60 years. It's 30 years old. So the straight line depreciation is it's 50% obsolescence. Well, that may not be true. And the way that you obviously do that is look at other similar 30-year-old homes, deduct the land value, and is it 50% of replacement cost new? And more often than not, it's not. And so what happens is you will end up with a cost approach that is useless in terms of providing a meaningful indication of value, because we haven't taken the time to accurately calculate the obsolescence. And if we're not doing that, then we are providing results that really provide very little use in calculating market value. So, I get a lot of appraisers who will not use the cost approach because they say, well, you back into it. You calculate obsolescence by calculating the difference between the cost new and the present worth. And the only way to come up with present worth is to do the sales comparison approach. So if I've got to back into it, why do I need to do the cost approach in the first place? And while that's a legitimate question, the reality is the cost approach can provide some useful information that can help in developing adjustments when we start looking at the appropriately depreciated components within the property. But I think the thing that's worse is to develop a cost approach that is poorly done, and it doesn't accurately reflect replacement cost new or site value or obsolescence, in which case, in my experience, is probably one of the easiest ways to go in and discipline an appraiser, because they haven't appropriately developed it. And I think we need to do a better job of going through that process so that the cost approach is number one, it's meaningful. Number two, if you're going to do it, you better do it right so it doesn't get you in trouble.
From a standpoint of the cost approach and doing it right so it doesn't get you in trouble, would you recommend that appraisers take more classes in the cost approach? Or would you say, no, don't worry about it, you need to take classes and other stuff?
I think taking a good in-depth class on the cost approach is a very good idea. I think especially after having gone through the original qualifying education, to go in and do a deeper dive on the cost approach helps you to better understand how the cost approach can be a tool in helping you to do a better job on supporting adjustments. But I think having done that after you've been in the process for a year or two is probably more useful, simply because you've done a few appraisals now. You see some of the challenges that you encounter with the cost approach. So I think it helps you to better understand the application and why the cost approach can be a useful tool. And at the very least, we ought to be curious enough to understand, well, if my cost approach is giving me a result that's significantly different than the other approaches to value that I'm developing, maybe I'm doing something wrong. And maybe I ought to try to figure out why or what it is I'm doing wrong so that I can make sure that it better reflects the reality of a market.
Craig, from a standpoint of communication, and you mentioned that earlier, do you think that a deeper education, even a deeper practical education, specifically in appraising, do you believe that that would make the appraiser a better communicator?
Well, certainly having the practical education and understanding why I do what I do is the foundation of what we're doing in developing and communicating the appraisal. I think the problem we run into is that in standard one, within uniform standards, is I'm going through the process of developing my opinions and conclusions. Standard two is where I communicate those opinions and conclusions. And if I can't write, if I can't communicate, if I don't know what kind of information is useful to my client, it's pretty hard to produce an appraisal report that's meaningful if I can't write in such a way that I'm able to describe and provide the information that my client's looking for.
So basically what you're saying then is, not only does the appraiser have to be able to fill out the form, the appraiser has to communicate to the client why he or she filled out the form in that way, as well as how he or she filled the form out in that way. Is that correct?
Absolutely, that's correct.
Okay, so the deeper the education, very possibly the better the communication between the appraiser and the client. Okay. As we sit here, we're recording this in May of 2023. There is a great deal of controversy over some of the steps that the GSEs, specifically Fannie Mae, have taken relative to value acceptance, appraisal waivers, etc. And there are those among us who claim that value acceptance or value acceptance plus property inspection or appraisal waivers is the ruination of the real estate appraisal industry. There are those who say, well, it's going to make changes, but those changes are not going to be all that terribly important. And then there are those that say, what happened? Because they're not paying any attention whatsoever. So, and Craig, again, you are not functioning as a spokesperson for the ASB here. This is just Craig and Tim talking. So give us your take on appraisal waivers, value acceptance plus property inspection, so that our listeners get a complete, a 360-degree view, as it were, of this issue.
Well, I think as appraisers, we tend to think that the appraisal is the most important element of that loan package that the GSEs are looking to, buy and commoditize as a financial instrument. And so we think this appraisal is a very significant part of that risk analysis. And while it is absolutely a critical element, it may not be the most important part. So, I like to look at the loan, the risk analysis process that the lender's going through, and it is a three-legged stool. The first leg is the creditworthiness of the borrower. And I think if you were to evaluate the risk associated with the loan, if I've got someone who's got good credit, they've got a pattern of repaying their loans, the risk on that loan is a lot lower than if I've got someone who doesn't have a pattern or has a poor pattern of loan repayment. And so from a risk standpoint, and that's usually measured by the credit score. And so that's an essential element of that loan risk. The second is the income. Does the borrower have the ability to repay that loan? If they've got good income and they've got good credit history, it's a pretty safe loan. The third and final part is the collateral. This is the part that says, hey, if these guys don't pay the loan back, do I have enough collateral to satisfy repayment through foreclosure? Of course, nobody wants to go through that process, but the appraisal is that process that goes through and helps to establish what kind of collateral do I have. And from a lender's perspective, if I'm doing a 50% loan to value or even a 70% loan to value, of course, the question is, well, how do you come up with the value? But they're looking at a multitude of things out there, including assessment records and modeling and AVMs, and all kinds of valuation tools exist. But if they look at this and it looks like a pretty low risk loan, as a borrower, do you really want to pay the extra fees associated with getting an appraisal when you know that the property is worth significantly more than the loan amount? And so the GSEs, rather than automatically always getting an appraisal, are saying, well, let's evaluate our risk based on the other factors associated with this loan. And so I think as they look at some of these various value acceptance and waivers, and all of those things play into that determination on whether or not to get an appraisal. And usually when they're getting an appraisal, it's because they perceive the risk as being higher. Now, the most recent issues that we've had is, well, the GSEs have been looking at having third-party inspectors and they having the appraiser do a desktop appraisal. And of course, that causes concerns because the appraiser in those situations hasn't had their feet on the ground. They haven't been able to touch and feel and smell the property. And I'm relying on a third party to provide me with that information. How reliable is that information? Can I rely on this thing, on this information being provided? And ultimately, I mean, I'm sure you've heard the same thing, is that, well, you can't do that. That's a violation of USPAP. As a USPAP instructor, does that question ever get posed to you?
All too often. Yes, Craig, all too often. And the USPAP does not now, nor has it ever had, a requirement that the appraiser put boots in the living room. Now, the USPAP does require the appraiser to disclose if he or she did not. But no, USPAP has no inspection standard. It has no photography standard. Those are appraisal conditions. Those are assignment conditions imposed by the client. And the appraiser has every right to reject them if the appraiser so chooses. And
it's been interesting because I think a lot of times appraisers forget that they're the ones who develop, are required to develop the appropriate scope of work based on the evaluation problem that's laid before them. And they do that in consultation with their client based on the intended use and intended users. And one of the things that I think appraisers don't realize is that there are a wide range of desktop appraisal that are being offered. I think every appraiser is aware or has seen a desktop offer that has come across their desk or their portal for some, ridiculously low fee. And the pitch from the AMC is, well, gee, if you do this appraisal for $50, you can fill out the form in 20 minutes and you're making over $100 an hour. I've certainly had that pitch made to appraisers in our office. And, what I think we fail to recognize is that filling out the report is less than half of the appraisal. You still have all of the obligations under standard one, and you still have all of the requirements for file maintenance or record keeping rule and all that you have to comply with. And so I know there are appraisers out there that do a lot of these desktop appraisals based on a photo that's provided and the best available public record information. I think the thing that happens is appraisers who have seen that equate that as being the same thing as what the GSEs are trying to do, and they're completely different assignments. Usually when you see these assignments coming through such as that, the log into your portal, fill out this little form, sign it, bam, you're done in 20 minutes, is that the vast majority of the loans being made right now are made from lenders who have a loan that falls under the de minimis rule. And so they have the option of being able to get an evaluation done or get an appraisal done. And in many cases, these lenders are saying, well, all things being equal, I'd just as soon have an appraiser look at the data and come up with a conclusion than an evaluator that is not under the same standards and doesn't have the same experience that an appraiser does. And so the evaluation standard is quite a bit different than the standards that are, they're not, I shouldn't say quite a bit different. They are different. But realistically, the inspection requirement for an evaluation is somebody needs to go verify that the improvements are there. They don't have to go inside. They can, but they generally just want somebody to go in and verify that the improvements are there. And that is the case. You'll always hear about the Uber driver who went and did the inspection. Well, usually what you're doing is you're having someone, a low paid, usually it's a very low skill set that's required to go verify that something is standing and take a picture. And then they will send that to the appraiser, and the appraiser is then required to collect enough information from public records and MLS to try to develop a desktop appraisal on that property. Well, the requirements for your client, the intended use and intended users, are completely different than the desktop appraisal that's being done by the GSEs. In those cases, many of those clients will allow the use of an extraordinary assumption about quality and condition, but the GSEs don't. And so the scope of work required to complete a desktop appraisal for a GSE loan is considerably different than for someone who's doing a home equity loan, where they're using this appraisal in place of an evaluation. And I don't know, I think we kind of think that all desktop appraisals are created equal, and they're not. I think the only thing that I have seen is that appraisers are not as careful on doing some of these things as they need to be, because they still have all of the obligations of standard one. And even though my client may have developed a proprietary form that they want me to fill out, if I don't comply with all the reporting standards in standard two, I'm going to have a problem when if somebody turns that appraisal into your enforcement agency. So it's a tricky situation. And simply, there's no such thing as a USPAP compliant form. The only thing that makes an appraisal USPAP compliant is how the appraiser communicates the assignment result. How they develop the appraisal and how they communicate the assignment results. And so, if you've got forms that don't have all of the elements that are prescribed under Standard 2, I've got to either be able to alter the form to include that additional information, or I better withdraw from the assignment because I can't do it if it doesn't comply. And that applies to every appraisal and every form or any other method of communicating assignment results, is that the appraiser makes these things compliant, not the form or the form generator or the form developer. And I think that has become a really big source of confusion by a lot of appraisers.
Craig, there's that word communication again. So basically what you're saying is whatever medium the appraiser uses to communicate the appraisal, it's got to be, for lack of a better term, communicative. It just can't be a filled out form. It's got to tell the client what the appraiser did, how the appraiser did it, why the appraiser did it, and why the appraiser reached the conclusions he or she reached from those analyses. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct.
All right, Craig, we're getting close to the end here. What else is dear to your heart that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think from my perspective, we are seeing a tremendous amount of change. I think you and I have talked about the inflection point this year with the introduction of AI and some of the other tools that are beginning to emerge. And if, as appraisers, we are kind of stuck in the routine where I just want to do stuff the way I've always done it and I don't want to change, change is going to happen. And you will not be very valuable as an appraisal professional if you don't learn how to utilize some of these emerging tools that are starting to take place. And I know that it's uncomfortable. I'm not that comfortable with some of the AI technologies, but I'm excited to learn how to use them so that I can be someone that can utilize the technology to make me better. My belief is, and I think that I've found this to be true, is that the thing that makes an appraiser valuable is the skill set that they bring. And that skill set needs to be emerging so that we're producing information that people want and that they're willing to pay for. And so it's going to require ongoing improvement of our abilities in order to be to a point where people will want to pay us for the work that we produce. And I think if we will get our headspace in a place where, hey, I'm excited about this business, I'm going to learn how to develop some of these new tools so that I can be more effective. I've always believed that if appraisers' results are better than anything else, that you won't be able to be replaced, or at least replaced easily. And I think that the way we make our skill set more reliable than anything else is to stay abreast of some of these emerging technologies and tools so that we can couple our human intuition and abilities with these tools so that we provide good, reliable valuation services.
Craig, if someone needed to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
Email is always an easy way to do that. valuepro@gmail.com. There's no E in value, so it's VALUPRO@gmail.com. You can always search YouTube under Craig Morley Appraiser. We've got a couple of videos that I made one video a couple of years ago on this desktop and some of the pitfalls with that. If you want to watch that, that'll give you some ideas on what to do and what not to do. And then I've done another one that talks about the 5 most common errors that appraisers make in doing appraisals on residential properties. And if you want to look at that, it'll give you some ideas. Usually it's just a good way to make sure that we're backstopping the work we're producing so that we don't find ourselves with a deficiency that causes us problems.
Greg, thank you. Let me thank you for being here. Let me thank you both personally and professionally. I appreciate your advice and your counsel as well as your time. And anything else before we sign off?
You just enjoy a beautiful Florida day and maybe a little rainstorm in the evening, and we'll be wishing we were out there with you.
You guys could use the rain. Well, Craig, again, thank you. And to all of you who just watched this video, thank you. We appreciate it. Hit those like and subscribe buttons. And this is the shameless commerce part, but hit those like and subscribe buttons because we'll appreciate it. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate it. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everybody.